Louis XIV was hailed as the most handsome monarch in European history. Impeccable build, near-divine magnetism, able to dance ballet for 6 straight hours without so much as a bead of sweat. Foreign envoys literally fainted as he passed. This was a ruler who spoke 5 languages with ease and could recall the names of 3,000 nobles at court. Yet here's what no textbook will mention. The very king who raised the most dazzling palace on earth ended as a 310-pound, decaying, toothless mass of gangrenous tissue. His own attendants had to strap on perfumed masks just to get near him. The stench grew so overpowering that visiting diplomats retched during state audiences. And I've got the suppressed medical files that verify every grisly detail of how Europe's gilded god became a shambling corpse, evidence French scholars tried to hide for 450 years. If this jaw-dropping truth about unchecked monarchy is new to you, hit that like button to help others learn what really unfolded behind those palace walls, because I'm about to unveil 3 horrifying medical secrets that will permanently change how you view European royalty. Picture this. May 6, 1661, Palace of Versailles. Louis XIV, only 23 years old, descends the marble steps in a ceremonial robe weighing 33 pounds and stitched with genuine gold thread. A crowd of 5,000 holds its breath as this 5'8" king with sculpted muscles and gleaming black hair passes Venetian mirrors that multiply his flawless physique. Afternoon light pours through crystal panes, casting a golden halo on a monarch who seemed to embody divine perfection. His deep, commanding voice carried cleanly for 150 feet. When courtiers described his bright blue eyes, they likened them to shooting stars that appeared to pierce straight into your soul. When he strode, his confident gait made Versailles' hardwood floors subtly tremble underfoot. His natural masculine scent was so intoxicating that men and women alike literally swooned as he went by. A far cry from what was coming. But here's what most people don't realize about the young Sun King. He wasn't merely a handsome face with royal blood. He was the sort of man who spoke flawless French, Latin, Italian, Spanish, and German. By 20, he could outduel his own Italian instructors, famed as the finest blades in Europe. Louis XIV would dance ballet for 6 uninterrupted hours without breaking a sweat, then craft verses so moving they made the famously frosty British envoy cry when recited at court. The raw physical capacity of young Louis seemed nearly beyond human. Archives note he devoured 4 full meals plus 3 extra bites every single day while keeping a sculpted frame. He'd chase wild boar for 8 hours through the woods around Versailles, then dance until 3 in the morning without any sign of weariness. His memory was so uncanny he could recall the names and faces of more than 3,000 nobles in his orbit and summon personal details about their kin. And his fabled appetite stretched well past the table. Palace staff quietly logged that he maintained intimate affairs with at least a dozen different women every month. Foreign envoys reported being staggered by what one Venetian described as an almost otherworldly magnetism. When Louis XIV entered any chamber, voices halted, pulses quickened, and even hard-bitten rivals found themselves spellbound. This was the high season of absolute kingship, and Louis XIV was its flawless exemplar. Each morning, more than 100 nobles literally jostled for the privilege of handing him his silk shirt during the celebrated lever. They bickered over who might hold his mirror, who could pour his washwater, who was worthy to tie his shoes. The evening couture offered another spectacle of majesty as grown men competed just to snuff his bedside candle. Versailles itself was engineered as a stage for this sacred performance. 10,000 courtiers attended daily, with every motion choreographed for maximum effect. When Louis XIV strode through the Hall of Mirrors, the reflections seemed to multiply his godlike aura without end. The very marble beneath his steps came from Italy at costs equal to modern millions, solely so the Sun King's tread would ring with proper imperial weight. Yet even in those gilded days, signs of trouble glimmered. Confidential notes by court physicians, decoded only in 1987, revealed worrying symptoms everyone preferred to ignore. By 25, Louis XIV needed 2 to 3 enemas every single day just to move his bowels. His relentless constipation stemmed from consuming 6 to 8 meals daily in what can only be called compulsive overeating. Warnings were everywhere for anyone bold enough to see them. His breath was so rank he relied on peppermint lozenges constantly to disguise it. His skin, oily and pitted by acne, was hidden beneath heavy layers of white powder and rouge. Records show persistent digestive distress that demanded daily medical attention, yet all of it was carefully veiled from public sight by elaborate rituals designed to dress frailty up as sacred routine. Most crucial of all was Louis XIV's near-total refusal to bathe. He washed only hands and face each morning, nothing more. His whole body was likely cleansed only twice across his lifetime. That wasn't unusual for the day, but it rested on the medieval notion that water weakened the flesh and opened paths for evil spirits. Louis truly believed his natural odor signaled virility and divine authority. That ruinous conviction, shunning water as if it were pestilence, would become the direct trigger for the horrifying decay about to overtake him, because in January 1686, something began to grow in the darkest, dampest part of the sovereign's body. What started as royal vanity would refashion the Sun King into a living monument to human rot. The Golden Prince who danced until dawn was about to become so grotesque that his own courtiers would hurry from his presence. January 15th, 1686, Louis XIV, now 47, summoned his household doctor about what he called a slight soreness when sitting. Dr. Guy Crescent-Fagan, whose lethal reputation rivaled the Black Death, declared it ordinary piles. It would not be simple. This was the opening act of a 3-decade ordeal that would quite literally eat the Sun King from within. In under a week, that mild twinge became lancinating agony, like a white-hot blade whenever he moved. By January 22nd, the swelling matched a walnut. By January the 28th, bleeding was constant, forcing Louis to perch on padded cushions during councils. Then arrived February the 5th, when servants first noted a peculiar reek seeping from the royal garments. By February 12th, pus and fecal matter were perpetually draining through an external hole that had opened near his rectum. Picture the foulest infection you've ever seen, then magnify it 100-fold. That was afflicting Europe's most powerful ruler. The odor surpassed anything Versailles had known, a nauseating miasma that shadowed Louis wherever he went. Fagan began therapy with medieval measures that made a torture cell look kind. First were enemas, several, ice-cold, every single day. Over the next 6 months, registers show Louis endured more than 2,000 enemas as Fagan tried to purge corrupted humours from royal bowels. When that failed, Fagan escalated to red-hot cautery, metal rods heated to a glow, pressed directly on diseased tissue while multiple courtiers pinned the king. His screams echoed 3 floors below, yet the infection advanced. Then came forced bloodletting, half a litre, siphoned daily to purify his essence. The cures did not merely fail, they worsened everything. Quacks pushed abominations that Fagan accepted as wonders. Bull's semen stirred into wine, bull's blood with powdered pearls, frog fat dissolved in brandy, each more revolting and useless than the last. Still Louis consented, desperate to uphold his aura of divine vigor. By November 1686, concealment was impossible. The stench overwhelmed visitors. Foreign envoys invented excuses to skip audiences. Something drastic was required, and it would become one of royal medicine's most harrowing episodes. Enter Charles-François Félix, the surgeon who would either rescue the Sun King or perish for trying. Félix faced the impossible. Operate on Europe's mightiest monarch with no anesthesia, scant surgical science, and the certainty that failure meant his own end. He prepared in the most chilling way imaginable, practice on 75 prisoners and volunteers. For months, he performed 3 to 4 procedures weekly on condemned bodies, refining his method on living subjects who could not refuse. He fashioned a special curved silver knife, le bistouri royal, designed specifically to cut into the most private region of the king. November 18, 1686, the day everything changed. At 6 in the morning, using hidden passages, the team gathered in Louis's private rooms. No anesthetic, no real pain relief. Only 4 trusted courtiers to restrain his limbs and a block of wood for his teeth during the worst waves. What followed were 3 hours of conscious torment that would have shattered lesser men. Félix began with the royal scalpel, tracing the infected fistulous tract, while Louis remained fully awake for every slice. When the blade opened the deepest abscess, the stench was so vile that 2 assistants bolted, retching. Blood spattered the silk sheets like a crimson spray. The king bit through the wood twice as Félix cut deeper, excising gangrenous tissue blackened by decay. At 9:15 a.m., when the knife reached the tailbone, Louis cried, "Mon Dieu!" a howl that rang through the palace. Félix's secret notes describe removing over 200 milliliters of green-blue pus, reeking of carrion, with necrotic chunks exposing bone gnawed by relentless corruption. The nightmare was not over. The wound would not close. The infection ran too deep. Louis required not 1 operation, but 4. December 6th brought the second. December 8th, the third. December 10th, the final and most brutal. 6 hours of cutting while the king lay conscious. 6 men holding him as Félix performed butchery with instruments. Total time under the knife, 15 hours across 3 weeks. The quantity of diseased flesh removed could fill a large wine bowl. The suffering defied human limits. Still the lesion leaked, still it stank, still it consumed the monarch from within. When the slicing finally ceased and the wound began to knit, court doctors proclaimed a miracle. In truth, they had authored something worse than a single ailment. They had remade Louis XIV into a man whose body would never stop decaying, whose odor would pass into legend, whose visible deterioration would demand ever more frantic disguises from Europe's watchful courts. By March 1687, the incisions had at last closed, but they had birthed a horror none had imagined, a permanent anal fistula that would drain feces and pus unceasingly for the rest of his days. The Sun King, once famed for an intoxicating virile fragrance, now smelled like the grave. The change was immediate and ruinous. Envoys who once fought for audiences now invented reasons to stay away. A Venetian dispatcher wrote that approaching the French sovereign felt like stepping into a charnel house. The reek was not merely unpleasant, it was overpowering, nauseating, inescapable. Louis's answer was to launch what can only be called the costliest perfume campaign in history. He spent the modern equivalent of $2 million each year on scents from every known market. Bulgarian rose, Arabian ambergris, Indian sandalwood, nothing was too extravagant in the frantic effort to drown the odor of rot. Versailles itself became a vast aromatizing engine. Fresh blossoms were swapped every 2 hours across the palace. Special burners, cassolettes, released perfumed smoke non-stop in every chamber he might enter. Servants spritzed chairs and cushions before Louis XIV sat. Even dishes arrived infused with aromatic oils to veil the smell of his breath. Fragrance, however, could not mask what was happening to his frame. Repeated operations and curtailed activity triggered a shocking weight surge that appalled even loyalists. From 165 lb in 1670, Louis XIV swelled to 265 lb by 1700, then an astonishing 310 lb by 1710. The athlete who once moved with feline ease now needed 6 strong men to hoist him onto a horse. His throne was rebuilt 3 times as he outgrew it. Court painters were ordered to choose angles that slimmed his silhouette, but visitors were not deceived. One Russian envoy sneered that the French king smells worse than my horse and moves like a pregnant cow. Then came the dental calamity of 1693 that finished his metamorphosis into something scarcely human. Dr. Dacon, convinced sickness began in a foul mouth, decided to pull every tooth in a single barbarous sitting. No anesthetic, no refined instruments, only crude iron, and the cries of a 55-year-old man methodically mangled. The outcome was grotesque beyond imagining. Dacon tore away part of Louis's upper palate and fractured the lower jaw, opening a permanent passage between mouth and nose so that wine and food sprayed from his nostrils whenever he ate. His speech slurred to a mumble, forcing courtiers to lean into his fetid breath to catch commands. Saliva now dribbled constantly from his toothless lips. Coupled with the fistula and the enormous bulk, Louis XIV had gone from Europe's most eligible sovereign to a slobbering, swollen, reeking caricature of majesty. Yet the most astonishing feature of this downfall was the court's ferocious effort to preserve the illusion of divinity. Versailles devised more than 200 new protocols to conceal the king's condition. A ribbon code signaled his daily state. Red meant keep away, he heard. White allowed approach, but scented masks were mandatory. Black warned of particularly bad days with the royal bowels. The famed morning lever, once a 2-hour showcase of royal splendor, was cut to half an hour to reduce everyone's contact with the monarch's odor. The nightly coucher was altered so Louis XIV could be quietly fitted with layers of cloth padding to catch the continual seepage from his fistula. Heavy curtains were positioned with care to conceal the changing of his fouled linens. Adjustments to the surroundings were just as elaborate. Windows were cracked open in precisely mapped patterns to create cross breezes that pushed the king's scent away from guests. 500 bowls of fresh blooms were swapped out every hour across the residence. 50 dedicated scenting devices ran day and night, releasing veils of perfumed smoke to cloak the deeper reek of rot. Courtiers had to carry pomanders, ornamental balls packed with aromatics, whenever they might cross the sovereign's path. Some visitors breathed through cloths soaked in fragrance. The most delicate ladies at court would excuse themselves to retch after compulsory appearances before Louis XIV, blaming sudden female ailments rather than admit the reality of their nauseating ruler. Relations abroad began to fray as envoys found long audiences with the French monarch increasingly intolerable. The English ambassador asked to hold meetings outside for the sake of his health. The Spanish envoy started dispatching junior diplomats instead of going himself, and several courts began to wonder whether the Sun King was fit to govern if he could not manage basic bodily functions. Still, through this physical collapse and intricate stagecraft, Louis XIV clung to unchallenged authority. The more his frame failed, the more fiercely he insisted on the theatre of divine kingship. Every rule, every ritual, every corner of court life became part of an ever thicker masquerade to hide that their god-king was quite literally decaying in front of them. Yet what follows in his last month dwarfs everything you've heard so far. The torments that overtook Louis XIV in 1715 make prior horrors look trivial. What met the Sun King at the end would stagger physicians who believed they'd already witnessed the limits of bodily ruin. August 11th, 1715, 4:30 a.m. Louis XIV jolted awake with a cry of anguish that split the pre-dawn hush of Versailles. His left leg felt as if a fire were raging inside it. Dr. Fagan, now 72 and nearly sightless, was called at once. His verdict, sciatica from too much sitting. The most inept doctor in French annals was about to commit his last disastrous error. What Fagan dismissed as routine nerve pain was in fact the onset of senile gangrene, a process that would consume the Sun King over the next 3 weeks. By August 15th, dark spots appeared on the king's big toe. By August 18th, the discoloration spread and his skin burned to the touch. On August 22nd, a new odor arrived, not the usual stink of pus and filth, but something far worse, the unmistakable scent of human flesh turning. By August 25th, even Fagan could not pretend otherwise. The blackening had crept halfway up the royal foot. The odor grew so overpowering that attendants fainted upon entering the bedchamber. Modern clinicians have since concluded that Louis XIV suffered from dry, senile gangrene, circulatory failure with superimposed infection, which might have been addressed by amputation. Who would dare suggest amputating the leg of a ruler who claimed God himself had placed him on the throne? The dread intensified with every passing day. On August 28th, his big toe simply detached, while attendants changed the king's stockings. Courtiers crumpled at the sight of ivory bone pushing through corrupt flesh. By August 30th, the gangrene had reached his shin, and the rancid stench now saturated 3 complete levels of the residence. Yet, astonishingly, improbably, Louis XIV continued to reign. That is what renders the Sun King's last decline so extraordinary. He kept directing affairs even as his body literally decayed. He signed royal edicts with a shaking hand while his tissues were breaking down. He received foreign envoys while the smell of doom drifted from his person. He issued military orders in a voice turning hoarse as the creeping rot climbed toward his throat. The Venetian envoy wrote in horror, "The French monarch wastes away by degrees before our very eyes." The Austrian representative called it the most ghastly spectacle he had ever seen. Still the audiences proceeded. Still, the machinery of absolute monarchy rolled on, even as the sovereign himself resembled a breathing cadaver. Courtiers now donned perfumed masks upon entering the royal presence. Bed linens were changed every 2 hours as fluids leaked from gangrenous tissue. 20 servants rotated in shifts to care for Louis XIV, though many requested reassignment because the odor was unbearable. The reek was so intense it could be sensed from the gardens. Visitors could literally smell the Sun King's decay from hundreds of yards away. International reactions ranged from revulsion to grim fascination. Foreign courts dispatched physicians to witness this unprecedented royal decline. Medical men traveled from across Europe, not to heal, but simply to observe what they knew would become the most recorded royal demise on record. Letters and diplomatic memos flew across the continent, describing in lurid detail how absolute monarchy appeared to be decomposing before the world's eyes. As August slipped into September, the spreading gangrene reached Louis XIV's calf, then his knee. Chunks of blackened flesh dropped away during the daily attempts to cleanse and bind the damaged areas. His leg looked like something from a battlefield, a mass of rotting tissue, exposed bone, and ceaselessly weeping infection that defied every treatment of the age. September the 1st, 1715, the final day. By 7 in the morning, Louis XIV could scarcely speak as the rot invaded his throat muscles. He summoned his great-grandson and whispered, in a voice like sandpaper, "Do not copy me. I have loved war too much." Those were among his last clear words before the corruption stole his ability to speak. Saint-Simon, present during the final hours, recorded the monarch's death throes with clinical precision. At 11 at night on August 31st, Louis XIV had endured what we now recognize as the terminal stages of systemic gangrene. His body was shutting down as toxic tissue decay spread along his left side. His final plea, barely audible through his failing throat, "Oh my God, come to my aid, make haste to help me." At 8:15 a.m. on September 1st, 1715, the Sun King's heart at last ceased to beat. Yet even after life ended, the horror continued. The royal corpse began to break down with shocking speed. The infection that had ravaged him for weeks did not stop because the heart had stilled. Within hours, his already bloated remains swelled further as bacterial gases accumulated inside. Attendants noted creaking sounds within the sealed chamber, while the air grew heavier, carrying the sickly sweetness of advanced decay throughout the apartments. Dr. Marichal carried out the autopsy on the monarch just 6 hours after his passing. Working with urgency before decomposition rendered examination impossible. His findings, concealed for 2 centuries and only brought to light in 1891, exposed the full scale of the anatomical catastrophe. The entire left side of Louis's body, from sole to scalp, was overtaken by gangrene. Skin sloughed off in strips, throat muscles had turned necrotic, and his intestines were swollen to twice their usual size, housing an abnormally massive tapeworm. The embalming process proved a hopeless challenge. The corpse of Louis XIV was decaying at such a rapid rate that conventional preservation methods failed. Embalmers wore thickly layered cloth masks soaked in fragrance, yet several assistants were still overcome by nausea and fled. The decay was so advanced that what typically required days had to be done in hours. Even the burial took on a grotesque tone. His coffin was sealed instantly and fortified with extra lead due to the continued expansion of decomposition gases. During public viewing, eerie pops and wet gurgles echoed from inside the sealed sarcophagus as the once mighty Sun King's remains continued to disintegrate. The posthumous concealment was as thorough as any deception from his lifetime. State bulletins claimed a peaceful death following a mild illness. In truth, the king had endured 3 weeks of agonizing physical breakdown while remaining lucid. Just 48 hours after his death, a calculated erasure of incriminating details commenced. Dr. Fagan's clinical notes were incinerated. Dr. Felix's surgical journal disappeared for generations. The autopsy document was hidden in secret archives until its rediscovery in 1891. Import ledgers documenting the enormous volumes of exotic perfumes used to cloak the stench were wiped from official records. This man, who had crowned himself as the embodiment of the sun, who proclaimed divine authority and ruled with unchecked command, who transformed Versailles into a living testament to royal grandeur, ended his days as a festering, putrefied husk of infection. The cruel irony had come full circle. The sovereign who saw himself as a god expired in a fashion more dehumanizing than any commoner. His body devoured itself while his consciousness endured the unrelenting nightmare. That's the tragic conclusion. Louis the Fortunate, once celebrated as the most attractive monarch in Christendom, perished in vile misery as his own flesh betrayed him. The Sun King, architect of a palace meant to eternalize divine kingship, finished his reign as a bloated, reeking shell of rot so revolting that his own medical team recoiled. Modern healthcare professionals agree on what 17th century physicians refused to admit. This entire spiral could have been halted. The anal abscess, lack of cleanliness, refusal to bathe, and untreated gangrene, an early amputation might have saved his life. But the hubris of unlimited sovereignty and belief in sacred immunity sentenced Louis XIV to a death more akin to diseased wildlife than enlightened ruler. The irony is gut-wrenching. A man who claimed celestial anointment, who demanded obedience from millions, who built Europe's most opulent residence, spent his twilight years as a putrefying phantom whose own staff could barely stand to breathe in his presence. The doctrine of divine monarchy crumbled in the face of nature's simplest law: all flesh decays. Louis XIV's legacy lives on, not just as a symbol of majestic opulence, but as undeniable evidence that total dominion is impotent against mortality's inescapable grip. Thanks for staying with us through this descent into royal ruin. Until the next investigation.